Here's a radical idea. What if the opioid overdose epidemic is really a loneliness epidemic? The overdose epidemic is getting pretty serious, y'all. 130 people die every day across the U.S., according to the most recent estimates from the CDC. 5 people die every day right here in North Carolina. And I'd encourage you to think about the human beings that are represented behind those numbers, right? Go ahead and take in this picture. Anyone recognize it? Those of you who are from North Carolina watching this video, Dean Smith Center at UNC Chapel Hill. The Smith Center holds about 21,000 Tar Heels at full capacity. So go ahead and take a breath and take in that number of people. And then empty that stadium. And then do that again 4 times over. And you'll start to get close to how many people died from drug overdoses last year. 72,000, according to the CDC. And about 70% of those deaths were related to opioids. To give you a little perspective, at the peak of the AIDS epidemic in 1995, about 43,000 people died from the disease in the United States. It's about 2 of those Dean Smith Center stadiums. So next year, we'll likely more than double that with overdose deaths here in this country. And unlike the AIDS epidemic, it doesn't appear that we've hit the peak yet with this overdose crisis. Deaths from drug overdoses, and specifically those related to fentanyl, have been skyrocketing, with no statistically predictable end in sight. It's gotten so bad that in some places, local morgue infrastructure is insufficient for processing the sheer number of dead bodies that are coming through the systems. In Ohio, morgues ran out of room last year, and local authorities were forced to rent space and use temporary cold storage trailers instead. In New Hampshire, there are no longer enough medical examiners to perform routine autopsies on every case. One embalmer in Florida had to quite literally come out of retirement to help deal with the influx of bodies that was coming through his county. These overdose tragedies are happening every day all around us, in our families, in our neighborhoods. And as the crisis worsens, it's all over the news and media. People are spending a lot of time talking about why it's happening and what to do about it. As a society, it seems we're responding in one of 4 ways to people who use drugs and who are at risk for overdose. We either arrest them, we tell them to go to AA or NA and clean up, we make them go to rehab, or we use the one evidence-based method for actually keeping people alive, which is to give them naloxone, name brand Narcan, so that they can reverse an overdose and use drugs in a way that's more safe. But unfortunately, none of these things are actually working in the sense of reversing the tide of the overall epidemic and crisis. We see death rates continue to rise. Despite putting people in jail, we see massive rises and increases in incarceration rates, especially for those related to small-time drug possession. Unfortunately, 12-step models have less than an 8% success rate, according to some studies, and the relapse rates post-treatment for opioid use disorder specifically are, by some estimates, greater than 91%. And while naloxone or Narcan keeps people alive, they're still at risk for another overdose, by some estimates at higher risk if they've already had one overdose. I'm here to tell you that the reason why none of these things are working is because of this one key word in the way that we frame the problem: them. We consider addiction always their problem, not ours. The root cause of the drug overdose and addiction epidemic crisis is this us versus them mentality. It isolates us and them. In our society, there are 2 prevailing narratives about addiction. At one extreme end of the spectrum, we have this idea that addiction is a moral failing caused by a lack of self-discipline or too much hedonistic partying. While at the other end of the spectrum, we're led to believe that addiction is something entirely beyond our control, that certain chemicals are just so strong that once they get their hooks in you, you're doomed. This is the story that we hear about the crisis in the news, that all of this is a result of overprescription, that pharmaceutical companies made these drugs widely available and people just automatically got addicted. Under this narrative, once you're an addict, you're always an addict. even when you're in recovery. You'll never truly heal or be able to live a, quote, normal life. These things we're trying aren't working because they either isolate people physically for their addiction, such as putting them in jail or rehab because it's a moral failing, or many treatment options isolate people psychologically as, quote, addicts, as sick people. What the science is increasingly showing is that the difference between being exposed to a chemical and getting addicted to a chemical has a lot to do with a person's social context. For years, scientists referred to this one experiment to prove that addiction is a result of chemical hooks. The classic experiments supporting the conventional view of addiction were based on a single rat alone in a cage, a small cage called a Skinner box that was about 3 times the size of the rat's body length. Scientists would give a rat in this environment 2 options for drinking water, one that was pure and one that was laced with either heroin or cocaine. In this experiment, which was replicated hundreds of times over the course of the 20th century, the rat would continue going back to drink the drug-laced water until it either forgot to eat and died or overdosed on the chemical and died. But in the 1970s, a professor in British Columbia looked at this classic experiment and noticed that there was one pretty significant variable going unaccounted for in the way the experiments were being run, and that's that rats are inherently very social creatures. It's not natural for them to live in an isolated environment in a small Skinner box. So this team of scientists redid the experiment, accounting for that natural variable of rats living in larger groups, building a larger enclosure, filling it with running wheels, other rats to play with, toys and tunnels, and offered the same 2 options for drinking water to those rats living in community. And under those conditions, what we saw is that rats living in community consumed less than 1/4 of the drug-laced water than rats who are living alone. And much more compelling, in my opinion, none of the rats died. So what this and other subsequent research is suggesting is that addiction is all about connection and disconnection. And our focus on it being either a moral failing or disease, on the individual or on the drug, actually only exacerbates the effects of isolation that might be the root cause of addiction in the first place. When you look at it this way, addiction is less a disease of the individual as it is a disease of the community. It shows up in individuals as a brain-based disease, certainly, with genetic and epigenetic factors predisposing certain individuals to the disease. But from a greater perspective, it's truly a problem of how individuals within a larger group are relating to each other. One thing that we all need in order to thrive is healthy bonds and healthy connections. As Professor Peter Cohen of the University of Amsterdam says, human beings have a deep need to bond and form connections. It's how we get our satisfaction. If we can't connect with each other, we'll connect with anything we can find, the whir of a roulette wheel or the prick of a syringe. We should stop talking about addiction altogether and instead call it bonding. A heroin addict has bonded with heroin because they couldn't bond as fully with anything else. The fact is, when we don't have the right kinds of relationships, community, and connection in our lives, we get sick. And that sickness shows up as addictive and compulsive behavior. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, sure, but humans are a lot more complicated than rats. So let's take a look at humans in particular. To an even greater degree than our primate cousins, and much more so than rats, human beings evolved with a distinct evolutionary advantage for social bonding. We have a whole suite of social behaviors, social connections, language that we use to communicate with each other. We form groups and tribes and trade. We build these grand civilizations that we love to live in. So it makes sense that there must be a lot of complicated neurochemistry going on behind the scenes to drive us to form these social bonds. But here's the really interesting part. That neurochemistry is specifically implicated in opioid compounds. Our neurochemical reward systems use naturally produced opioids in our brains to reinforce social connection. Let me say that again. We have naturally occurring opioids in our bodies that are involved in making social connection literally feel good. You've probably even heard of them. Endorphins are the most commonly known ones. Endorphin stands for endogenous morphine. The chemical structure of endorphins is almost identical to morphine, heroin, and other opiates that can be produced synthetically. Now, I'm simplifying a lot here, but it all basically goes down in this part of the brain called the striatum. An easy example of the way these natural opioids interact in our bodies and the experience of social connection can be seen if you administer naloxone or Narcan to a healthy person. Naloxone is that life-saving opioid blocker that emergency response teams use to revive people from an opioid overdose on something like heroin or fentanyl. But if you give it to somebody whose body is not flooded with synthetic opioids, it still blocks their opioid receptors, meaning they can't process heroin, but they also can't process any naturally occurring opioids like endorphins in their body. And as a result, what people report experiencing first after receiving naloxone is a sudden and shocking feeling of disconnectedness and disassociation, a strong sense of isolation and loneliness, even when reading letters from family members and friends who they know rationally love them. So you might guess what this means for those of us who don't have healthy social relationships in the first place. For many, many people, our brains are actually starving for the experience of meaningful connection. Today, we find ourselves living in a world where meaningful human social connection and all the natural opioids that come with it are harder and harder to come by, where social media is totally changing the landscape of how we interact with each other, and where the jobs that have historically offered millions of Americans sort of de facto social tribes and networks are increasingly getting outsourced and automated. Or workers find themselves in the rising services economy, where they're contracted on a temporary basis that makes it almost impossible to build lasting social connections at work. Often we order things on Amazon rather than going into a store or working together to get the food and other things that we need. And even when we do go into a store, we might find ourselves going through a self-checkout lane, interacting with a computer rather than a human being. Much of our amazing technological progress has certainly had the impact and effect of making our economy more efficient and technically freeing us up to do more stuff, but we are also just generally and objectively less likely to interact with other people than we used to be. Now, I'm not here to say that technology is evil or that we need to revert to being a hunter-gatherer society, but what we do need to acknowledge is that we simply aren't interacting and connecting with each other as frequently as we need to in order to have healthy brain chemistry. When we do come together in parties and social gatherings in the modern world, we can often feel just as lonely, if not even more isolated, than we do when we're actually alone. The overdose crisis we're facing today is really a manifestation of this underlying neurochemical problem. In a world where many, many people lack the type of social connections that trigger our brains to produce opioids to signal satisfaction from social connection, an experience we need to be healthy humans, the market was suddenly saturated with readily available synthetic ones from the pharmaceutical industry. It was honestly like throwing a lit match into a haystack that was soaked in gasoline. Connection is a basic human need. When we don't get it, we get sick. And that sickness shows up as addictive and compulsive behaviors. These days, a lot of people are filling that need with heroin and fentanyl, for sure. But before they get there, a lot of people are getting hooked on painkillers and all kinds of other pharmaceutical cocktails first. Then there's this culture that glorifies popping bottles in the club and encourages social drinking to black out. Weed is getting legalized for legitimate medical purposes, but we also see a lot of people using it in ways that are way beyond medicinal. Some of us are addicted to eating too much, some to eating too little. We're all encouraged to be addicted to work and to do whatever it takes to get the job done. And almost all of us are managing screen addiction in some way, shape, or form, whether it's porn, shopping, or the rush of that little red notification. So in a world where our society is changing so rapidly that our culture of connecting with each other hasn't had time to catch up with the technology, we are all experiencing isolation in different ways, and we are all compensating with addictive behaviors. No matter who you are, if you're not getting the amount and quality of human connection that the brain needs in order to stay healthy, then you're going to get addicted or bonded to something. Now, that said, there's a range, right? Some bonds and addictions are more dangerous than others, And as you can see here on this scale, where we have things like caffeine or marijuana addiction at the less dangerous end, but still addictions and often uncontrollable behaviors, just as much as the more dangerous ones like self-harm or using IV drugs. Some of the addictive and compulsive behaviors at the more dangerous end of the spectrum often show up in human beings who have had significant trauma experiences, but not always. Unfortunately, there's also really no one universal way to measure the severity of trauma. The best way to understand psychological trauma is to compare it to physical trauma. Imagine you trip and fall on a sharp object, and it pierces your skin and creates a nasty wound. If you're able to get medical attention quickly, get a bandage put on it, and apply some antibiotics, the wound is less likely to get infected. It might even heal and not even leave a scar. But if you don't have the resources to get medical care or can't get to the hospital quickly enough, that same wound might get worse. It could get infected. It could scar. It could get so badly infected maybe that it even has to get amputated. The same thing happens psychologically when someone experiences an emotional wound. If they don't have a safe place to process the experience, don't have a strong community to help them feel supported, or don't have access to emotional therapy and other trauma healing resources, the same emotional wound that happens to two people might end up becoming a debilitating experience for the rest of one person's life, whereas in the other case, it might be able to be completely resolved through a healing process. Because of this, I think it's much more accurate to understand trauma as some degree of insufficient connection, or a person's inability to connect with themselves or others for whatever reason. That could mean that it's the result of a major traumatic event that caused a person to be unable to ever trust another person again, thereby inherently preventing connection experiences from occurring. Or it could be the gradual accrual of many smaller, isolating events. Either way, the more difficult it is for a person to connect, the more likely they are to seek out stronger and potentially more dangerous bonds to numb the pain of the experience that they're having in life. When these strategies that we use as a society to fight the overdose epidemic do work, it's clear that it's because of a coinciding experience of connection. Although these things don't work often, they do work sometimes, and when they do, it's because people have some diminished sense of isolation, some experience of belonging or trust with another person, whether that's through a great relationship with a sponsor, experiencing the support of a community while in prison, connecting really deeply with themselves or a therapist during treatment, or just having that genuine, compassionate conversation with someone who actually won't judge them at a syringe exchange or syringe access program. Now, even though none of these strategies are actually turning the tide of the overdose crisis and driving our death rates down, the one that is the most evidence-based for actually stopping death is this last one, giving people the equipment that they need to stay safe while they're using drugs. This approach is known as harm reduction. The National Coalition on Harm Reduction offers this definition, that it's a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing the negative consequences that are associated with risk-taking. It's honestly something that we all practice whenever we take risks, which is every day of our lives, starting from the moment we get out of bed. We are almost constantly, as human beings, going through the process of assessing risk, deciding what level of risk we're willing to take, and doing things to minimize the risks that we don't want to take. A great example of this is wearing a life jacket when you're on a boat and you don't know how to swim. By being on the boat, you've taken a risk that you might fall out and drown. Wearing a life jacket is a harm reduction strategy to prevent the risk of drowning. Often, harm reduction and recovery are considered opposites in the world of addiction and addiction recovery. Either you're supporting drug users by giving them sterile syringes and naloxone, or you're telling people that their behavior is categorically wrong and that they have to change and get sober. At SeekHealing, we argue that that distinction really misses the point, because all you've done is effectively split human beings into two groups, drug users and non-drug users, us versus them. But if addiction is something we all experience, then it doesn't really matter who's using drugs or what drugs they're using. At the end of the day, we're all humans and we all need connection. So a better way to look at it is to remember that recovery is not an outcome. It doesn't have particular features or look like something that you can point to and say, yep, that's recovery. You can't replicate the concept across different people's experiences. It's not total abstinence from all mind-altering chemicals because some people can drink and smoke in moderation. And it's not moderation because some other people absolutely cannot moderate and have to remain totally abstinent in order to stay safe. It's much more accurate to describe recovery as an ongoing, never-ending process. You're doing it right if you're doing the work of constantly reevaluating and changing your relationships with chemicals or behaviors that don't serve you. So there really is no us versus them. Every single one of us are in recovery or healing, whether we're recovering from a chemical addiction or not. We all face a variety of potential addictions and bonds every day, and we have to evaluate what does or doesn't serve us in any given moment. Whether we're figuring out better ways to manage our pain than using heroin or cocaine, or we're figuring out how to just be okay being alone rather than binging on Netflix. The traditional model for addiction recovery tends to miss this opportunity to see recovery as a process. Instead, it usually emphasizes recovery as an outcome by focusing on whether someone is using or not using. In the traditional model, we usually begin with someone who identifies as a, quote, addict or alcoholic. This person comes to meetings to connect with other people who identify as addicts, and as such, sometimes get to experience the element of connection that is so critical to the healing process. Addicts who recently, quote, got into recovery get matched up with another addict, someone who has had enough time substance-free to serve as a sponsor or an advisor of sorts. Sponsors set an example for the recovery outcomes that this model is designed to encourage, which is 100% abstinence from most mind-altering chemicals. Depending on the region or fellowship, there is some variation in what is considered a mind-altering chemical and what isn't, but the path to becoming a sponsor or otherwise succeeding in recovery requires uninterrupted stretches of abstinence, however it's defined by that particular fellowship. As such, addict-sponsor relationships are formed to support those in early recovery. These people can and often do interact in very meaningful ways in the wider community and fellowship of other addict-sponsor relationships. But unfortunately, too often these communities become functionally separate from the rest of, quote, normal society, where human beings interact over a huge range of shared common interests besides just sobriety. And, as we've discussed, unfortunately this strategy just doesn't deliver on its own goal. People don't stay abstinent. The relapse rates are as high as 80% within the first month. What we see in the traditional model is that it really only just starts to scratch the surface of the need for connection in addiction recovery. So at SeekHealing, we take those building blocks of that traditional model and hone in on the special sauce that makes it work: connection. SeekHealing delivers a hybrid harm reduction recovery model that provides free support services to anyone at any stage in the process of addiction recovery. There are no drug tests, and the program doesn't measure success in terms of relapse. Instead, success is measured in terms of an individual increasing their capacity for meaningful social connection. Rather than limiting our services to those who identify as addicts within the recovery community, SeekHealing invites people to join from across the community, so long as they identify as a seeker, someone who's committed to the process of continuously redefining their relationships with chemicals or behaviors that don't serve them. Since we started the pilot program about a year ago, it's been interesting to witness how the community has grown. It's evolved to have a pretty diverse spread of seekers. About 1/3 are people who either are still using or in early recovery, another third who might identify as being in long-term recovery from addiction or other chemical bonding patterns, and the last third are people who've never struggled with substance use. That last category tends to include people who have other emotional or mental health struggles, people who self-isolate or are feeling lonely for other reasons, like getting old and retiring, as well as people who have lost loved ones to drug overdoses and addiction and want to give back. No matter what your reasons are for joining, all seekers are encouraged to attend listening training first. This is a professionally facilitated course that teaches you how to listen better to yourself and others. It's available in both weekend retreats and as a weeknight course every Tuesday evening. Both parts, listening better to yourself and other people, are necessary in order to break free from social anxiety or to transform what's usually superficial conversation in your life into meaningful connection. Listening training teaches you how to identify your own needs so you can identify what's serving you or not serving you, both in your bonding patterns as well as your relationship dynamics. It also teaches you how to really listen to other people, rather than just planning what you're going to say next in your head while you're listening, or thinking about how you're going to give them advice and how they could fix their situation. It's really an in-depth training that uses a variety of techniques from the spheres of nonviolent communication, authentic relating, and interpersonal psychology to reprogram the communication habits that keep us from connecting with each other authentically. Everything else that's offered throughout the SeekHealing program are really ways to work on what it is we learn in listening training. So we have connection practice meetings, also original recovery meetings that happen every day of the week to explore healing and recovery through group conversations that get really real and where no topic is off limits. Program management also provides oversight and a careful matching process to pair seekers up with each other for weekly one-on-one meetings. These meetings are a place to practice connection and authentic relating one-on-one, and in that way, it's a little different from having a 12-step sponsor. A sponsor is someone who helps you work the steps, gives you advice, homework, and instructions, whereas your seeker pair is someone who's specifically there to not give you advice. They're there to make sure that every person has at least one place where they can go to express what's really going on, what you're really feeling, what you're really using or not using, without any fear of judgment. For many people, this works as a great complement to the 12 Steps program. Having both a sponsor and a seeker pair can be incredibly supportive for the journey to healing and recovery. Seekers in the program also come together regularly at substance-free socials and gatherings to practice connection in group settings. We like to say that these parties or gatherings are both substance-free and small talk-free. These are potlucks, board game nights, shared meals, and a thing we do called emotional socials that happen on a weekly basis every Friday night. Depending on the person, experimenting with connection in a group setting might be just as intimidating as trying it one-on-one with a seeker pair. Because of that, all Seek socials, meetings, and activities have quiet spaces nearby or in the same space where seekers can withdraw from the group as long as they need to before returning. And all events are staffed by at least one volunteer space owl who's there to listen and hold space for anyone having a hard time. In addition to the socials, the gatherings, and the connection practice meetings, the weekly program calendar also features free classes and activities for people to explore in their recovery journey. Things like yoga, meditation classes, foraging hikes, sports activities, aerial arts classes, martial arts, art therapy, slacklining workshops, sound healing sessions, and so much more. And of course, in addition to free access to all these meetings, socials, and activities, every seeker is encouraged to be of service to the community in some way. Service work is a huge part of healing and recovery, and the nature of the Seek program creates ample opportunities for people to give back to each other, whether it's helping with event setup, visiting seekers who are sick or homebound, serving as a space owl at socials to provide that service of listening to somebody who needs it, or doing outreach at local medication-assisted treatment clinics, at syringe access programs and emergency housing shelters to, again, give that service of listening to people who may not have received it in a very long time. The final element of the SeekHealing program is here in this upper right-hand corner, and that's the extra care track. The SeekHealing project has special funding set aside for people who are at risk for a drug overdose, which means anyone who has a bonding history with either opioids or amphetamines and who has recently gone through any kind of major transition. Transitions can include things like a change in housing, getting out of an addiction rehab program, or going to the hospital for other medical reasons. In addition to all of the other core program services and calendar events, anyone who's at risk also has the option of committing to a 6-month extra care program that involves weekly check-ins and accountability with program management. This part of the program provides free access to direct services like counseling, trauma healing, acupuncture, bodywork, nutritional counseling, and a range of other holistic services that have been proven to be effective in treating and supporting people who have substance use disorder. Since we started the program about a year ago, there are now over 100 seekers participating at various levels of engagement. As I mentioned, among these, about 2/3 are people who have some kind of history with substance use, whether it's early or long-term. I'd say about half of those who have a substance use history are folks who also work a 12-step program and find that Seek is a great complement to their recovery program. The other half are people who are looking for an alternative and found that in Seek. Since everyone is a seeker, substance use history or not, everyone involved in the SeekHealing community benefits from this deep dive into connection, and the space that the program makes to deliberately set aside time for real connection to occur in your life. When seekers enroll in the program or join the community, they are asked what their intentions for healing and recovery are, whether they're going for 100% abstinence, whether they're abstaining from heroin but not alcohol, or stepping down from heroin using the help of a medicine like Suboxone or methadone, or something else entirely. It doesn't really matter from a program management perspective. But once those intentions are stated, the program does, with our program management team, whatever we can to support seekers in following those intentions and checking in periodically to see if the intentions have changed. And most importantly, we never terminate anyone from the program. There are no drug tests and no 3 strikes you're out. The SeekHealing project isn't about trying to steer people toward a particular destination with their recovery in the traditional sense of the word. We believe that healing is a lifelong process for all humans with no destination. The most that any of us can strive for is wellness and safety on that journey, and that looks different for everybody. So instead of creating shame around addiction and relapse, this project is here to empower each other to simply change our relationships with chemicals or behaviors that don't serve us, and to take whatever time and energy resources we need in order to do that. We help each other get our basic connection needs met so that we can all find our own reasons to live. So in quick summary, SeekHealing provides intentional experiences of connection and community to help people heal from addiction. We do this by treating both the community and the individual. Our community treatment begins with public harm reduction education, monthly seminars called Opioid Addiction 101 that educates the public in harm reduction and how to perform an overdose reversal using naloxone or Narcan. For people who want to join the community and work the Seek program, we have an open door policy, welcoming people who are currently using drugs, people who are pursuing 100% abstinence from all mind-altering substances, and people who are on medication-assisted treatment programs, as well as people who don't struggle with substance use and want to volunteer or are suffering with loneliness and isolation for reasons that go beyond substance use and chemical bonding. Everybody's welcome. The program provides ongoing support services for free to anyone who needs them. This includes pairing with trained volunteers or other seekers in the community activities, those free classes and workshops from a whole range of connection-boosting expressions and activities, as well as free access to therapeutic services for people who are at risk for a drug overdose. We also provide that deep dive in training and authentic connection, the listening training. This is a professionally facilitated training in how to better listen to others as well as yourself so that we can all start to break free from the patterns that don't serve us. I firmly believe that if we can start creating space for addiction rather than shaming each other for the various ways that it shows up in all of our lives, that we can create a world that we all actually want to live in rather than escape from. This is the only path forward to dig ourselves out of the overdose and addiction crisis that's killing our friends and family. So wherever you're at in your healing journey, whether you're trying to change your bond with a certain chemical, feel isolated in the world, or want to volunteer, you can call or text us at this number to join the Asheville program today, 828-547-0222. We'll get back to you to schedule your first conversation, which will be followed by many more as you meet other seekers in the community and work with everybody else to figure out how to best get your needs met. When it really comes down to it, we are each other's best medicine.